In a recent talk, you focused on the data ecosystem around connected vehicles. What kinds of data are sensors gathering in so-called smart cars, and what considerations and concerns are there around that data?
So, in a typical car today, there are somewhere between, in a basic car, I should say, there are somewhere between 60 and 100 sensors that are gathering data every second about what the car is doing and how it's performing. That's a basic car. More advanced car, there can be additional hundreds of sensors. And initially, those sensors were kind of in place to collect data to monitor the vehicle's emissions and to make, to prevent, for pollution prevention purposes. However, a lot of that data can be repurposed to do all sorts of other things. So in my talk, I'm going to show how you can use that to essentially build out a person's pattern of life. You can see what stores they're going to, when they, just kind of when they're active, when they're not, where they live, all these other different things that you can do with it. And in the end, I think there are a lot of uses beyond what it was originally intended for.
And so, what kinds of industries is it appropriate for?
So I could see advertisers wanting to get a hold of this information. I don't know that consumers would want advertisers getting a hold of this information, but I could see a lot of other kinds of uses for it. For example, let's say you manage a fleet of vehicles. You could use this data to perhaps optimize fuel usage. So for what I mean by that is you can measure the exact rates at which your vehicles are consuming fuel, and if you know the paths they're taking, you could find the optimal locations and times to buy fuel based off of the fuel prices. That would be like another possible use. I'm going to be talking about trying to identify a driver's mood based on their driving habits gathered from the data that is in the vehicle. So I could think of all sorts of things like that. You could recommend products like, hey, you are obviously very angry. Maybe some Mozart might help with that. Or maybe a cold beer. But there's all sorts of things that you could do with that data that beyond the original monitoring the emissions of a vehicle.
And so when you look at the benefits versus the risks, in your opinion, is it worth it?
I think yes and no. I think there's a lot of potential benefit. What worries me is that we kind of as a society are charging forward with ubiquitous data collection without kind of really stopping to reflect on the risks of it, on the greater implications. And usually what I've seen tends to happen is that we don't think about that until there's some sort of incident or breach or something like that. And that kind of gives us pause to say, well, maybe that wasn't the best idea in the first place. So I'm hoping in this presentation and one I gave at Strata in New York last year about connected homes is to kind of start somewhat of that conversation about informing people that first off, this data collection is in fact happening and that they do have a choice in the matter besides just clicking yes on those terms of, on the terms of service. But basically to inform people and get people involved in that conversation.
And so what kind of steps do we need to take going forward to ensure that it's more beneficial than harmful?
I think companies, first off, need to really think about security when they're building their products. And I know that's certainly not a revolutionary thing to say, but when I and other security researchers start to look at a lot of connected devices, it's really shocking to see the state of security that are built into a lot of these devices. And a lot of the reason is because the device makers just kind of assume, well, this is just a little sensor, nobody's going to be hacking into it, and even if they did, there's no value in it. And that is completely false.
And kind of shifting more generally, what areas of emerging tech are you keeping an eye on? When you read papers and studies, what are you looking at, and what things are you finding most compelling?
In terms of emerging technology, I'm most interested in technologies that are going to expand, that kind of lower the bar to entry for data analysis and make getting data and analyzing it easier. So there's, for example, there's an open source tool called Apache Drill, which really fascinates me, and I've been working with the developers kind of to help write the book on that. But I find that tool really useful because potentially it could dramatically lower the bar, in the level of difficulty rather, in gathering data, bringing it together, and ultimately analyzing that data and making it really useful. I'm also just generally interested in kind of other tools that make teaching and analyzing the data simpler. I'm a big fan of making things simpler, so I think that's really what will make things more accessible in the end. And so anything along those lines, making things easier, making things simpler, I like reading about and learning about.
And so, last question for you on a more personal level: what people and projects are you following? What are you finding personally exciting?
I find, so there are a few general subjects that I find very interesting. So people, I really like Daniel Tunkeling's blogs, and he's a former, I think, he's a former data scientist at LinkedIn. I'm not quite sure what he's up to nowadays, but I really like his writing. He talks a lot about just kind of the general philosophy of hiring data scientists, building data science teams, and I find his stuff very interesting. In terms of just kind of generally, I'm really interested in computer science education and basically expanding tech education to younger audiences. And I haven't taught, I do a lot of teaching, but I haven't taught younger kids personally yet. But I think this is probably one of the most exciting things that's happening right now, is that that more and more like children are learning these skills a lot earlier, and I think that's just going to enable them to do amazing things as you know, as we kind of go forward.
Well, thank you very much for talking with me today. It's been fun.
Thank you very much.